I'm Kimberly B Lewis, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself. So, I was born in 1964 in Charleston, South Carolina, to Betty Jane Dix Bussey, and my dad, Isaiah Bussey Jr. And they had not long moved to Charleston. They had lived in a couple of different places. They were from a little town, Windsor, South Carolina, and Williston, South Carolina, which were really almost side by side from one another. And interestingly enough, my mom did not move to that area until she was 16 years old. And how she got there is she had been living in a town called Dunbarton, South Carolina, which no longer exists. Dunbarton, along with several other very small towns and hamlets in that area, was seized by eminent domain by the federal government to make way for the Savannah River nuclear plant. And this was in the days when there was this rush to create an atomic bomb. And so they seized several farmlands and places across the United States looking for the perfect place that they could construct said bomb. And even when I was growing up as a little girl, I would hear hushed tones from my grandparents talking about, well, that was during the time we had to move out of the bomb plant. They just call it the bomb plant. And I never knew what they were talking about. And as a child, you were taught that you were to be seen and not heard. And so when adults were speaking, you didn't ask questions. And so I would just kind of wonder, bomb plant, what are they talking about? I didn't even know what a bomb was at the time. And so my mom and her family had to leave Dunbarton, and they weren't able to take very much with them. At the time, my grandfather, Aaron Dix, we called him, they used to call him Snaky Boy as a child, and his father, which we call Papa Dix, along with his brothers, all lived on 500 acres. They had 500 acres of rich farm land. And one day they were just told, like everybody else, you've got to go. And we'll pay you, but the payment was pennies on the dollar. And my grandfather was the only one who had just harvested and sold his crops. So he had a little bit of money. Everyone else in the family was allowing their crops to rest for that season, as is typical. You have a season where you're farming for several years, and then you let the crops rest and you let it regenerate. And so that's what had happened. And they had not harvested anything, so they didn't have a lot of money. So my grandfather was the only one who was able to buy just a little bit of land in a little town called Williston. Well, let me back up a little bit. His father was absolutely devastated. And in fact, he refused to leave. He refused to move. And so as my grandfather was trying to get the family situated and trying to buy a little parcel of land that they could, farm and trying to do all the things that needed to be done, as well as move the church that the family had built and move the school that the family had built, which they weren't able to move, and find the graves in which family members had died. And they weren't able to find all the graves. So many of my relatives are still buried out there where the Savannah River nuclear plant still sits today. So my grandfather had to actually forcibly take my Papa Dix, my great-grandfather, out of the house, screaming and kicking, before the bulldozers came and before they came to remove everyone forcibly. And he built him a little 2-room shack. That's all they really had time to do. And he had a little small house that he moved his family in. And his brothers and sisters found little homes that they could rent or they could share crop. So they went from owning their own land, hundreds of acres, to becoming sharecroppers. So that led into a lot of family issues, family trauma, if you will, family grief. Because the family up until that time had lived side by side. My grandmother had gotten to the 8th grade, so she was the official teacher. She actually taught at the school that they built. My great-grandfather and my grandfather and his brothers, they had all built the church, and they were all leaders in the church. My great grandmother was quite wealthy, and did a multitude of things and had a little store and all of those kinds of things. And so her house actually had two fireplaces, two chimneys on the house, which is how you knew if you had a fairly wealthy person in the family. But in one fell swoop, it was all gone. Now, my mother was 16 at the time. She was actually excited for the move because up until that time, she actually went to school at a boarding house, or I'm sorry, at a boarding school. So when she went to this boarding school, she would go on the weekdays, Monday through Friday, and then my grandfather would go pick her up and bring her back home for the weekend. And, it was just common in those days because they didn't have schools up to high school. They might have, something for up to third grade, fourth grade. In this case, fifth or sixth grade in that town, but then you had to go to another town in order to receive further education. And so she actually saw Williston as this, big place. She had never seen it before, but she thought it was a fun and exciting place. And she said, I was a silly kid. I didn't even know that it was not necessarily a good thing. I thought we were going to move to this big city and I had big dreams. And so when they moved to the farm, she had to start school there. And my father was actually the school bus driver. And so when she got on the school bus the very first day, he couldn't take his eyes off her. He nearly wrecked the school bus trying to watch her. And he went home after school and he told his mother, Mama, I think I met my wife. She's a little bit on the portly side, but she's real pretty. And so then he began to talk to her and woo her. And eventually they began to date. And then she got pregnant with my brother. They got married and moved to that same 2-room little shack eventually. First, they moved to his parents' house. And then they moved to that shack once Papa Dix had passed on and Mama Dix had passed on. So my 3 siblings, my brother, they went on to have 2 other children. And my 2 sisters were all born in that 2-room shack. And they were born through the help of a midwife. There weren't a lot of doctors in the area, and so midwives were very common. In fact, Mama Dix, my great-grandmother, had also been a midwife. And so that was very common. But my dad always kind of worried about that. He worried about there being an issue. My oldest sister had been born very lightweight, and she only weighed 2.5 pounds. And they had to feed her goat milk in order to get the weight up on her. But they did, and she's healthy, and she's still, kicking and grinning today. And she did fine. So my dad began to build his career. And so he knew he had a young family, that he needed to find a skill, a trade. And he wanted to do something that was going to give him a little more sustainable money than just farming. He'd grown up farming, but he also knew the ups and downs of farming. So there was a man in town who was looking for young men to train in the brick masonry field. So my dad began as an apprentice. And it's so cool to go back to that town today because I still see the houses that my father actually built. They're still standing. And so his craftsmanship lives on, even though he passed on in 2019. So he became an apprentice, became very, very good at what he did, and went on to work in different cities and try to make more money. And so they lived in Virginia for a little while, but my mom could not stand the snow. She hated the cold weather. She was always cold. And it was over when she came down the steps to go outside one day and she fell on those icy cold steps. And she got back in that house and she said, I don't care what you do, but I'm leaving. I'm packing my stuff and I'm going. And she started packing her stuff. And so my dad had no choice. He had to start packing his stuff too. And back to South Carolina they went. And so then they lived in Beaufort for a little while and they had wonderful friends in Beaufort. And then my dad decided, you know what, I need something a little bit more. I need to take care of my family a little bit better. Because by that time, they knew that they wanted another child. But it took a little time. And so they moved to Charleston. And lo and behold, not long after they moved there, my mom discovered she was pregnant with me. So being pregnant with me, my dad actually was a little bit nervous until it was decreed that no public entity could discriminate against an individual based on the color of their skin. So he knew that his fourth child would be born in a hospital, a large hospital. They didn't have to take a chance, with at-home birth. He had already, worried himself sick about the other three births. And so he thought, oh, this is wonderful. You see, it was 1964. And the Civil Rights Act in 1964 came about. And just a couple of months later, my mom went into labor with me, September 2nd. And that day it was raining cats and dogs. And so he scooped her up, he put her in the car, and they knew it was time. But by the time that they got to the Medical University of South Carolina, my mom had been hemorrhaging. And she felt that something was wrong. She didn't know what, but she knew it was different than the other three births. So he scooped her up and he got her into the emergency room and he put her down in a chair. And in the center, there is a welcome desk. And at that welcome desk, there were nurses and doctors who were just chatting and laughing and hadn't even really noticed that they had come in. And so he ran up to the desk and he, panicked and he just started screaming, my wife, something's wrong. She's having a baby. Come help her. And the group of doctors and nurses, they turned their heads. They looked away from him and they ignored him. They fell completely silent. And he just started running around that desk and he kept trying to get their attention and screaming. And they continued to just ignore him. And so after several passes around that desk and running down the hallway, he came back and he saw the puddle of blood at my mother's feet. And he screamed at them again at the top of his lungs, as loud as he could, you have to help. My wife is dying. And one of the nurses turned to him and she said, just leave her over there. We'll get to her. Well, he knew what that meant. They weren't going to get to her. You see, prior to that time, that particular hospital had been a white-only hospital. And in town, there was a black-only hospital. But my dad thought, well, the 1964 Civil Rights Act is passed. So we can go wherever we want to go to receive the best service possible. But he soon found out that that was not the case. But he saw a wheelchair in the corner, and he grabbed that wheelchair, and he scooped my mother up, and he put her in it. And she was writhing in pain. And he said, hold on, baby. Without even thinking about going to get the car, he knew that the black-only hospital, which was named the McLennan Banks Hospital, was just down the street. And so at full tilt, he ran in the pouring down rain, and he got her to McLennan Banks Hospital. And when he got her into the wheelchair ramp and got her inside, they immediately came running. And they saw that she was covered in sweat, she was covered in rain, she was covered in blood. They put her on a gurney and they rushed her to the emergency room. And the doctor who delivered me by cesarean section. You see, I was a breech baby, and that's why she was hemorrhaging. And literally, I could have died and she could have died. And I tell that story because so many people want to believe that those things just didn't happen, or they happened a long time ago. And they just don't, nobody thinks like that anymore. Nobody acts like that anymore. But a lot of those people are still alive. And I don't know whether their hearts and minds have changed. But I'm here to tell you and here to show you that it's real. It still happens. It happened in 1964. We still have some of those same mindsets today. So that's why it's important for us to really elevate our communities, elevate our voices, and be more sharing and giving. It's hard to dislike somebody when you get to know them. It's really hard to dislike anybody. So fast forward a little bit in that story. I used to always ask my dad, how did I get the name Kimberly? Because my sister's name was Vivian, one sister was Judy, my brother's name was Marion. Well, they all got their names from, soap opera stars and music stars and entertainment folks. And, that people would would name their kids after, those kinds of common names that they heard on the radio or saw on television. But Kimberly was odd. And most times my dad couldn't even pronounce it. He would say, Kimberly! He would call me to bring him tea or some snack or something like that. And I thought, okay, you couldn't have named me because you can't even pronounce the name. So what's up with that? And so he said, well, I didn't name you. It was the doctor who delivered you. That particular doctor was visiting from South Africa. And the Kimberly diamond mines were discovered in 1964, again, just a few months shy of my birth. And so he thought it was very appropriate because I am a diamond. I'm sure that you can get that. You get that already. So, it was a great lesson to learn, but it wasn't something that we really talked about a lot. I remember the story. My dad had told me a few times about the story, but I really didn't think anything of it. As a kid, you just don't really think about the impact. I just thought, oh, that's kind of cool, but never even told my friends, anything about that. I think if one of my friends asked me, I just said, oh, well, they got the name from a doctor, the doctor named me, and really didn't think much about it. And several years into my career with Goodwill Industries, I was working on a newsletter with our marketing person, and we were talking about Black History Month, and we were just talking about our own family history. And so she told me a little bit about her family history, and I told her a little bit about my family history. And when I told her that story, she's the first person that I had really told the whole story to. Her mouth fell open. And she said, well, you got to write that. You got to tell that. You got to tell that story. And I said, nobody wants to hear that. No, nobody really cares. I mean, that's just my story, but nobody really cares about it. And she said, no, it's a part of history. You have to tell that story. It's a part of history. And so little by little, I became more and more comfortable with telling the story and finding out a little bit more about my history and my family. So as a little girl, living in Charleston, I had an idyllic childhood. First of all, the street that I lived off of that butted up to my street was called Playground Road. It was amazing because there were actually 4 playgrounds in the neighborhood. And so I ran from playground to playground. And later on in my high school years, they had even built an indoor swimming pool. And so I swam. I had the opportunity to take tennis lessons in high school, and we would practice at the tennis courts that were almost across the street from my house, from my neighborhood. And so I enjoyed those wonderful summer days of running and playing and riding my bike and doing all the fun things that kids love to do. And that, I wish kids would get back to today, just being active in the community. We knew everybody in our neighborhood and they knew us. Of course, that could be bad too, because if you did something wrong, it would get back to your house before you got back to your house. All of my teachers in the early elementary years lived in my neighborhood. My first grade teacher, Miss Bryan, was in my neighborhood. My third grade teacher, Miss Wright, was in my neighborhood. When I wasn't doing so well in math, Miss Wright told me to come to her house in the summertime every day, and she tutored me in math so that I could do well in the next school year in the 4th grade. So that's the kind of community that I grew up in. And so it was a wonderful community. My sisters, my brothers, they were 9, 10, and 11 years older than I was. So they took care of me. They looked after me. They took care of me. I'm sure that I was a nagging, little sister at times, trying to follow them around and all of that. But I hung out pretty well with my mom and dad as well. I learned so much from them. And so I would go to job sites with my dad when he was laying bricks. Sometimes I would go where my mom was working. She worked at J.M. Fields, which is a department store. And she was the head supervisor over the cafeteria. And so back in those days, department stores had these kitchens. They had, counter kitchens and cafeterias. And so you could get breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, all kinds of stuff. And my mom made the best chocolate eclairs and the best cream puffs. And so she would, if they had any left, she would bring those home. So I really, really, really enjoyed that. But then when JM Fields closed their doors, she actually was called to work through a temp service, called to work at the Medical University of South Carolina, the very hospital that turned us away during our birth. And I didn't even think about the ironic nature of that, until again I got much older. But she actually became a supervisor at that hospital, and she was the sterile processing supervisor. That's the person who oversees the surgical equipment and makes sure that everything is properly sterilized and on case carts. And she worked there for 17 years until she retired. And then she did some other work in the community, and she would do some private duty setting for a little while as what she called old people, even though she was well into her 70s when she was doing this kind of work. But she's always had a gift for caring and nurturing for people, and a gift for the community. One of the things I remember so fondly is that my mom was a wonderful cook and baker. Now, my dad cooked all the daily food. He actually taught us all how to cook, how to cook eggs and bacon and grits. And we had a hot meal every single morning, every single morning. Since my dad was teaching brick masonry, he had, was not only a brick mason, but he got a job teaching a vocational class at Wando High School. And so he woke up when we woke up. He was up before we were. He actually woke up 5 o'clock in the morning every morning. But he would get up and he made a hot breakfast for the entire family. And so I learned how to cook regular food, and even what's Charleston cuisine that people pay a lot of money for these days, like she crab soup and red rice, and catfish and oysters and shrimp and low country boil, which is a mixture of sausage and shrimp and corn and potatoes and onions. Learn how to cook all that stuff from my dad, and even things he made up. But the baking was my mom's territory. And so my mom would often bake sweet potato pies, coconut pies, chocolate cakes, red velvet cakes, anything. She'd bake all kinds of things. And she wouldn't just bake for the family. She would also make extras. And it was my job then to go to the neighbors and give them their pie. And so she knew what each neighbor wanted. Actually, they all wanted all of it. It didn't matter if she had a batch of sweet potato pies that she baked at the same time as the coconut pies. They all wanted both of them. And so I would go to our neighbors on our street and give them each their pies. And so that taught me a sense of giving and a sense of doing. Shortly after I was born, my dad also accepted his call into the ministry, and eventually, a few years later, became a pastor. So I grew up in the church, sitting on his knee in the pulpit sometimes before he would preach, because I kept wiggling around and wouldn't be still. And, I always wanted to get to my daddy's feet. And so, he would tell me to come on up, and I'd sit there quietly until it was time for him to give up and give the message. And then he'd put me in another chair or send me back down to my mom. And so I grew up working in the church, and I grew up working in the community, and just saw that as just a part of life. I didn't think there was any way else to live, because we were always doing that. I remember one of the churches that he pastored in a small town called Walterboro, South Carolina. It was actually the largest church that he pastored, and we had about 500 members at that time. And my dad came up with this idea to give back to the community. And so he wanted to give back in the way that they did the best, which was cooking. And so the entire family made a meal for the community. And so we made enough food for a couple of thousand people. My dad had a steam table built and customized, and we would kind of pre-cook a lot of the food ahead of time. And then it was written up in the newspapers, and they would send out flyers and announcements. And whether you went to our church or not, whether you were just a community member or you just wanted, a hot meal, you could come after service that Sunday, and we served and fed the community. And we did that for a number of years, probably 10 years or more, that we did that. So again, it came through service. So it was no surprise, I guess, that when I decided to kind of hang up my quill, so to speak, as a newspaper journalist, and I was a journalist for the Post and Courier newspaper in Charleston, South Carolina, for about a decade. And it was no surprise that I would venture into the nonprofit world. Now, that was not my intention. I didn't even know. Yeah, I knew a little bit about nonprofits, but I never even thought about it. I never thought about, working for a not for profit. I respected them because I knew how hard they worked and that they were serving the community. But I saw my role as just a volunteer. And so I began volunteering. And through my volunteer work, that led to employment with a not for profit. It was called Family Assistance Management Services. And we help people with their finances. And so if you had someone who was receiving a check, perhaps they were a veteran, or perhaps they were getting a disability check and they were chronically ill, or they were always in and out of the hospital, and they needed an agency to responsibly manage their funds to make sure that their mortgage got paid, or their rent got paid, that their light bill and their phone bill got paid, their insurance got paid, a little money put aside in savings, so that if they were sick and in the hospital for any length of time, none of that stuff would lapse. And so we had a number of clients, probably about 200 clients. And I worked with individuals with all kinds of disabilities who had all kinds of different backgrounds. And it was just, really a cool place to be. But I also learned so much. There was a woman there. She is the founder of the organization, and she also owns several businesses. And her name was Helen Singletary. And I love Miss Singletary. We called her Miss Sing. But she taught me so much about love and loving people and loving your community and serving your community, and about business. So she really was my first business mentor. And I just enjoyed working with her so much. But it led later on to my nonprofit career. And now I have been with Goodwill Industries for 21 years. And I serve people because, that's just who I am. And so, I just want to tell this story a little bit to give you a little insight about what I do and why I do it. And who knows what the future is going to bring, but I'm sure it's going to be in the service of mankind.